The conference room at the Federal Building in downtown Phoenix fell silent as the hiring committee reviewed the final candidate's resume. Margaret Chen sat across from 5 stern-faced officials, her hands folded calmly in her lap despite the weight of their scrutiny. The woman before them appeared unremarkable. 58 years old, graying hair pulled back in a simple bun, wearing a modest navy blazer that had seen better days. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Miss Chen, began Director Harrison Blake, his voice carrying the authority of someone accustomed to making decisions that affected national security. I have to be frank with you. Your application is unusual. You list no formal law enforcement experience, no military background, no federal service record. Your employment history shows 20 years as a hotel concierge and 18 years as an executive assistant, yet you're applying for a senior protection specialist position with our VIP security division. Margaret's expression remained unchanged, though those who knew her well might have caught the slight tightening around her eyes that suggested she was choosing her words carefully. That's correct, sir. Deputy Director Sandra Williams leaned forward, her tone skeptical. Miss Chen, this position requires extensive knowledge of threat assessment, protective formations, emergency protocols, and crisis management. These are skills developed through years of specialized training and field experience. What makes you think you're qualified for this level of responsibility? The third committee member, Assistant Director Robert Hayes, shuffled through the papers before him with obvious frustration. Furthermore, the background check shows significant gaps in your employment verification. Several of your previous employers are listed as classified or information unavailable. That's highly irregular for civilian positions. Margaret nodded slowly. I understand your concerns. The nature of my previous work required certain discretions regarding client confidentiality. Client confidentiality? Blake's eyebrows rose. Ms. Chen, you were a hotel concierge and an executive assistant. What kind of client confidentiality could possibly justify classified employment records? The fourth member of the panel, Security Chief Patricia Moore, had been studying Margaret with the trained eye of someone who'd spent decades evaluating people for their trustworthiness and capability. There was something about the applicant that didn't match her humble resume. The way she carried herself, the careful positioning in her chair that allowed quick movement in any direction, the subtle scan she'd performed of the room's exits and sightlines upon entering. Ms. Chen, Moore said, her voice measured, your references are equally puzzling. You've listed contacts at various hotels and corporate offices, but when we attempted to verify these references, we found that many of these establishments have unusually tight security protocols for civilian businesses. Some required federal clearances just to speak with human resources. Margaret's response was calm, almost rehearsed. I worked with a diverse clientele during my years in hospitality and corporate support. Many valued their privacy highly. The fifth committee member, Training Director James Foster, had remained silent throughout most of the interview, but now he spoke up with barely concealed irritation. Ms. Chen, let me be direct. We have candidates with decades of Secret Service experience, former FBI agents, retired military officers with specialized protection training. These are people who've dedicated their lives to this work. What could you possibly bring to this position that they cannot? It was then that Margaret Chen made a decision that would change everything. She had spent the better part of 4 decades living in the shadows, protecting others while maintaining carefully constructed cover identities. Her work had taken her to every continent, placed her in proximity to world leaders, celebrities, corporate executives, and foreign dignitaries. She had prevented assassinations, thwarted kidnapping attempts, neutralized threats that never made the evening news, and saved lives in ways that could never be publicly acknowledged. But sitting in that sterile conference room, facing 5 officials who saw only an unremarkable middle-aged woman with a gap-filled resume, Margaret realized that her greatest protection operation was about to end, the one where she had protected her own identity. Directors, she said, her voice taking on a subtle authority that hadn't been there moments before, what if I told you that everything you think you know about my background is exactly what it was supposed to look like? The room's atmosphere shifted almost imperceptibly. Blake set down his pen and studied her more carefully. Williams stopped shuffling papers. Hayes looked up from the resume he'd been reviewing. Moore's eyes narrowed with professional interest. Foster leaned back in his chair, suddenly paying complete attention. Margaret continued, her posture remaining relaxed but somehow more present. 20 years as a hotel concierge. Do you know which hotels? The Willard Intercontinental in Washington, where every major political figure stays when they're not at the White House. The Plaza in New York, where foreign ministers and heads of state prefer to conduct their unofficial meetings. The Beverly Hills Hotel, where entertainment industry executives and international arms dealers apparently enjoy the same five-star amenities. Blake exchanged a glance with Williams. Miss Chen, are you suggesting? I'm not suggesting anything, Margaret interrupted smoothly. I'm simply pointing out that some concierge positions require specialized skills. When a foreign minister's daughter receives a credible kidnapping threat during Fashion Week, someone needs to coordinate with federal protection details while maintaining the appearance of normal hotel operations. When a tech billionaire's yacht is being surveilled by unknown parties, someone needs to arrange secure transportation and safe houses without creating diplomatic incidents. The silence in the room was now charged with a different energy. Foster was the first to speak. And the executive assistant positions? Various corporate entities, Margaret replied. Some legitimate businesses, some less conventional operations that required careful oversight. When multinational corporations become involved in activities that intersect with national security interests, someone needs to be positioned where they can observe, report, and occasionally intervene. Administrative assistants are remarkably invisible, even in the most sensitive meetings. Director Blake was beginning to understand that this interview had taken an unexpected turn. Miss Chen, what exactly are you telling us? Margaret reached into her purse, a movement so smooth and controlled that none of the five officials felt any alarm, though each of them later realized they should have. She withdrew a single business card and placed it on the table. It was plain white, with only a phone number and a government seal that none of them immediately recognized. I'm telling you, she said, that for the past 40 years I have been protecting people in ways that required my very existence to remain unacknowledged. The gaps in my employment history aren't oversights. They're operational security. The classified nature of my references isn't a mistake. It's by design. And the reason I'm sitting in this interview today is because my handlers have decided it's time for me to transition from covert protective operations to something more traditional. Williams reached for the business card with slightly unsteady fingers. The seal was indeed a government issue, but from an agency she couldn't immediately place. The phone number had a prefix she didn't recognize. What agency? Blake asked. The kind that doesn't exist in any organizational chart you've ever seen, Margaret replied. The kind that operates in the spaces between the agencies you know about. When the Secret Service needs someone protected but can't officially provide that protection, they call us. When the FBI has assets that require security but can't acknowledge those assets exist, they call us. When foreign intelligence services need to be monitored while they're operating on American soil, they call us. Hayes was studying her with new eyes. How do we verify any of this? Margaret smiled for the first time during the interview, and it was the smile of someone who had spent decades staying several steps ahead of people who considered themselves very clever. You call that number. You explain that Margaret Chen is sitting in your office claiming 40 years of protective service. And then you wait while they decide how much of my actual record they're willing to share with your security clearance level. The implications of what she was suggesting began to settle over the room like a fog. If she was telling the truth, they were looking at someone whose experience dwarfed their own, someone who had been operating at levels of classified work they couldn't even imagine. If she was lying, she was either delusional or running some kind of sophisticated con game. Moore was the first to voice what everyone was thinking. Assuming this is legitimate, why transition now? Why apply for a position that's several levels below what you're claiming to have already been doing? Margaret's expression grew thoughtful. After 40 years of protecting people who never knew I existed, I'd like to try protecting people who actually know they're being protected. There's something appealing about working a job where you can tell people your real name and where success is measured by visible results rather than the absence of incidents that never officially happened. She paused, looking around the room at the five officials who were struggling to process this revelation. Also, I'm tired of living in hotel rooms and corporate apartments. I'd like to work somewhere where I can keep my own coffee mug. Foster, who had been silent for several minutes, finally spoke. Ms. Chen, if what you're saying is true, you're vastly overqualified for this position. Director Foster, Margaret replied. With respect, that remains to be seen. I've spent 4 decades learning how to prevent problems. Your job here is to solve problems that prevention couldn't stop. Those are different skill sets, and I'm genuinely interested in learning whether mine will translate. Blake was already reaching for his phone. We'll need to verify your claims before we can proceed with this interview. Of course, Margaret agreed, though I should warn you that the verification process might take some time. My handlers will need to decide how much they're willing to reveal, and to whom. In the meantime, I'm happy to answer any questions that don't require me to disclose classified information. As the hiring committee began making urgent phone calls and sending encrypted messages to contacts and agencies they rarely interacted with, Margaret Chen sat quietly in her chair, looking for all the world like an ordinary woman, waiting for an ordinary job interview to continue. But in the space of 20 minutes, she had transformed from an unlikely candidate with questionable qualifications into a potential asset whose background was so classified that verifying it would require clearances above the level of the people interviewing her. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. The woman they had initially dismissed as inexperienced had just claimed to have more protective service experience than their entire department combined. And as the first return phone calls began coming in, with voices on the other end asking very specific questions about who was requesting information about Margaret Chen and why, it began to look like her claims might not be as outlandish as they had initially seemed. The interview was far from over. In fact, it was just beginning. While the hiring committee made their urgent phone calls, Margaret Chen allowed herself a moment to reflect on the journey that had brought her to this sterile conference room. The decision to emerge from the shadows hadn't been made lightly, and it certainly hadn't been her idea initially. 3 months earlier, she had been standing in the rain outside a charity gala in Seattle, wearing the uniform of a catering supervisor while maintaining visual contact with 3 separate assassination teams that had converged on the event. Her principal, a tech entrepreneur whose groundbreaking research in quantum computing had made him a target for both foreign governments and domestic extremists, was inside delivering a speech about digital privacy rights, completely unaware that his life hung in the balance. Margaret had spent 6 weeks infiltrating the catering company, learning the layout of the venue, identifying security vulnerabilities, and tracking the movements of potential threats. It was meticulous work that required her to disappear into her cover identity so completely that even her fellow caterers believed she was exactly what she appeared to be, a middle-aged woman trying to make ends meet with part-time event work. The operation had concluded successfully, as they always did when Margaret was involved. The threats were neutralized through a combination of anonymous tips to law enforcement, strategic misdirection, and one memorable incident involving what appeared to be a severe case of food poisoning that struck all 3 assassination teams simultaneously. Her principal completed his speech, announced his quantum computing breakthrough, and never knew how close he had come to not seeing another sunrise. But this operation had been different. For the first time in her career, Margaret had been assigned a handler who questioned whether it was time for her to consider retirement. Agent David Walsh had been her contact for only 2 years, having taken over when her previous handler retired. Unlike his predecessor, who had understood that Margaret's methods were unconventional but consistently effective, Walsh seemed uncomfortable with the autonomy she had earned through 4 decades of flawless performance. "Chen," he had said during their post-operation debrief at a coffee shop in downtown Seattle, "you're 58 years old. You've been doing this longer than anyone in the division. Don't you think it's time to consider stepping back?" Margaret had stirred her coffee slowly, a habit she developed when she needed time to consider her response carefully. "Has my performance declined?" "No," Walsh admitted. "Your track record is unmatched. But this job takes a physical and psychological toll. We've lost agents who tried to do this work for too long." "Those agents," Margaret had replied, "didn't have my experience base. They were recruited in their 20s from military or law enforcement backgrounds. They learned fieldcraft as adults. I've been doing this since I was 18. The truth was more complicated than even Walsh knew. Margaret's recruitment hadn't followed the standard pattern of identifying promising candidates and putting them through extensive training programs. She had been born into this world, in a sense, the daughter of a career intelligence officer who who had understood from an early age that his work required certain sacrifices. Her father, Thomas Chen, had been recruited by the agency in 1952, during the early days of the Cold War, when the government was hastily assembling networks of agents to monitor Soviet activities on American soil. He had spent his career moving from city to city, assuming new identities, building relationships with targets, and gathering intelligence that never appeared in any official reports. Margaret had grown up in this environment of careful deception and constant vigilance. By the time she was 10, she could maintain a cover story under questioning from adults. By 15, she could conduct surveillance without being detected and had learned to read people's body language well enough to identify potential threats. By 18, when most people were heading to college, she was ready for operational deployment. The agency had originally planned to use her as a short-term asset, someone who could operate in environments where a young woman would draw less attention than trained male agents. College campuses where foreign exchange students might be recruiting sources. Social events where diplomatic spouses gathered to exchange more than pleasantries. Cultural organizations where exiled political leaders met to plan activities that intersected with American interests. But Margaret had demonstrated an aptitude for the work that exceeded everyone's expectations. She could disappear into any role with complete authenticity. She had an intuitive understanding of human psychology that allowed her to predict how people would react under stress. Most importantly, she had the patience to spend months or even years building the relationships and gathering the intelligence necessary for successful operations. Her first major assignment had been posing as a college student at Georgetown University, where she spent 3 years monitoring the activities of several foreign nationals who were using academic positions to cover their intelligence work. She had earned a legitimate degree in international relations while simultaneously running surveillance operations and building networks of student contacts who could provide information about suspicious activities on campus. From there, her career had evolved organically. Each successful operation led to new opportunities that required different cover identities and skill sets. She had been a museum curator in New York, a tour guide in San Francisco, a bookstore manager in Portland, and dozens of other carefully constructed personas that allowed her to operate in proximity to her targets. The hotel concierge positions had been a natural progression. High-end hotels were gathering places for exactly the kind of people her agency needed to monitor: foreign officials, international business leaders, arms dealers, money launderers, and the constellation of intermediaries who facilitated activities that intelligence agencies needed to understand. As a concierge, Margaret had access to guest lists, travel itineraries, meeting schedules, and personal preferences. She could arrange transportation that included surveillance teams, recommend restaurants where listening devices were already in place, and ensure that certain guests ended up in rooms where their conversations could be monitored, all while maintaining the facade of providing exceptional customer service. The corporate executive assistant roles had served a similar function. Multinational corporations were increasingly involved in activities that had national security implications, technology transfers that might benefit foreign governments, business deals that could affect critical supply chains, financial arrangements that might be used to circumvent sanctions. Someone needed to be positioned where they could observe these activities and report on anything that might threaten American interests. Executive assistants were present at meetings where strategic decisions were made. They handled communications between corporate leaders and their contacts. They arranged travel and accommodations for business trips that might serve dual purposes. And because they were considered support staff rather than decision-makers, they were often overlooked by people who should have been more careful about what they said in front of them. What her handlers had never fully appreciated was how emotionally taxing this work had become over the decades. Margaret had spent her entire adult life living as someone else, forming relationships with people who never knew her real name, protecting individuals who never knew they were in danger. She had prevented countless tragedies and saved numerous lives, but she had no one with whom she could share these accomplishments. Her father had died 10 years earlier, taking with him the only person who truly understood the sacrifices she had made. She had never married, never had children, never built the kind of life that most people took for granted. Every friendship was potentially compromised by her need to maintain operational security. Every relationship was limited by the lies she had to tell about who she was and what she did. The conversation with Walsh in Seattle had forced her to confront a question she had been avoiding for years. What would her life look like when this career finally ended? She had accumulated substantial savings from decades of government pay with minimal living expenses. But money wasn't the issue. The problem was that she had no idea how to be Margaret Chen when Margaret Chen wasn't a cover identity. Her decision to apply for the position with the VIP security division had been born from a desire to transition gradually from covert work to something more conventional. She wanted to try doing protective work where she could use her real name, work with colleagues who knew her actual background, and measure success by openly preventing problems rather than secretly resolving them. The transition wouldn't be easy. 4 decades of covert operations had ingrained habits and reflexes that weren't necessarily appropriate for traditional protective work. She was accustomed to operating alone, making decisions without consultation, and maintaining multiple contingency plans that her colleagues would never know about. Learning to work as part of an acknowledged team would require adjustments on both sides. But Margaret was confident that her core skills would translate. Threat assessment, situational awareness, crisis management, and the ability to remain calm under pressure were valuable regardless of whether the work was covert or overt. Her experience with different cultures, languages, and social environments would be assets in protecting high-profile individuals whose lives intersected with complex international interests. More importantly, she was looking forward to the possibility of mentoring younger agents and sharing knowledge that had been accumulated through decades of operational experience. The agency's institutional memory was stored primarily in the minds of people like her, and much of that knowledge would be lost when they retired unless it was passed on to the next generation. As she sat in the conference room waiting for the verification process to unfold, Margaret reflected on the irony of her situation. For 40 years, her greatest professional achievement had been convincing people that she was someone other than who she really was. Now, for the first time in her career, she needed to convince people that she was exactly who she claimed to be. The phone conversations in the background were becoming more intense. She could hear Director Blake using terms like need to know and classification level with increasing frequency. Deputy Director Williams was speaking in the careful language that government officials used when they were trying to extract information from people who were authorized to withhold it. Margaret knew that the verification process would eventually confirm her claims, but she also knew that it would raise as many questions as it answered. The committee would learn that she had an extensive service record, but the details of that record would remain classified at levels above their clearance. They would confirm that she had relevant experience, but they wouldn't be able to learn specifically what that experience entailed. This was the challenge of transitioning from covert to overt work, proving competence without revealing the operations that had demonstrated that competence. Margaret would need to find ways to showcase her skills and knowledge without compromising the security of ongoing operations or revealing the identities of assets who were still in the field. But she was confident that she could navigate this challenge, just as she had navigated countless others throughout her career. After all, adapting to new situations and convincing people to trust her had been her profession for 4 decades. The only difference now was that she was finally asking people to trust Margaret Chen rather than one of her carefully constructed aliases. The woman who had spent her entire career protecting others while remaining invisible was about to discover whether she could succeed at being visible while still protecting others. It was a transition that would test everything she had learned about human nature, institutional dynamics, and the delicate balance between revealing enough to build trust while concealing enough to maintain security. As the first verification calls concluded and the committee members began exchanging meaningful glances, Margaret Chen prepared for the next phase of what might be the most challenging operation of her career, convincing people that her most unbelievable story was actually the truth. The first return phone call came 43 minutes after Director Blake had dialed the number on Margaret's business card. Margaret watched his face transform from skeptical authority to careful attention as he listened to whoever was on the other end. The conversation was brief, conducted in the kind of coded language that confirmed the caller understood they were discussing classified matters. "Yes, sir, Margaret Chen." Spelled C-H-E-N. "Yes, she's sitting right here." Blake's eyes never left Margaret's face as he spoke. "I understand. Yes, we'll wait for the documentation." When he hung up, the room's atmosphere had shifted dramatically. Deputy Director Williams leaned forward. "What did they tell you?" "Enough," Blake replied carefully. "Someone from the Washington office will be here within 2 hours with verification documents. In the meantime, we're instructed to treat Ms. Chen as a potential high-value asset and to discuss nothing about this conversation outside this room." Assistant Director Hayes frowned. "That doesn't actually tell us anything definitive." Actually, Security Chief Moore interjected, it tells us quite a bit. I've never seen a background verification trigger that level of response. Whatever Ms. Chen's actual background is, it's significant enough that agencies are moving people and resources just to verify it. Margaret had remained silent during this exchange, but now she spoke up. Directors, I understand your position is difficult. You're being asked to evaluate a candidate based on claims you can't verify through normal channels. Perhaps it would be helpful if I demonstrated some of the skills that would be relevant to this position, regardless of where I acquired them. Training Director Foster, who had been studying Margaret with increasing interest, seized on this suggestion. What kind of demonstration? Well, Margaret said, settling back in her chair, threat assessment is fundamental to protective work. Would you like me to assess the security vulnerabilities of this building? Blake exchanged glances with his colleagues. On one hand, allowing an unverified candidate to analyze their security seemed potentially problematic. On the other hand, her assessment might reveal whether she actually possessed the expertise she claimed. Proceed, Williams said finally, but understand that any attempt to gather intelligence about our operations will be viewed as hostile activity. Margaret smiled. Director Williams, I appreciate the warning, but I should point out that if I were gathering intelligence about your operations, this conversation would be taking place under very different circumstances. She stood and moved to the window, her movements economical and purposeful. Starting with the obvious, this conference room is on the 7th floor of a federal building with controlled access. However, the window faces west toward a complex of office buildings, any of which could provide sightlines for surveillance or worse. The glass appears to be standard commercial grade rather than ballistic, which means anyone in this room is vulnerable to long-range threats. Foster was taking notes. Continue. Quote, the elevator system uses keycard access, but I observed during my arrival that the cards are standard proximity readers with minimal encryption. Anyone with basic technical skills and 5 minutes of physical access could clone access credentials. The stairwells have emergency exits that can be accessed from the outside without triggering alarms. I tested this when I arrived early and conducted my own security assessment. Blake's eyebrows rose. You tested our emergency exits? Of course, Margaret replied matter-of-factly. I needed to understand the security environment before entering this building. The loading dock has a shift change at 2:30 p.m. when security coverage becomes minimal. The parking garage has blind spots in the northeastern corner where someone could position vehicles or equipment without being observed by your camera system. And your reception desk staff, while polite, doesn't verify visitors against photo identification. They rely entirely on the appointment system. The room had grown very quiet. Moore was the first to speak. How do you know about our shift schedules? I've been observing this building for 3 days, Margaret answered simply. Standard preparation for any meeting that might have security implications. I know that the evening cleaning crew arrives at 6 p.m. and has access to floors 1 through 12 without escort. I know that your IT support staff frequently props open secure doors when moving equipment. And I know that the federal marshal assigned to this building prefers to patrol the lower floors during the afternoon shift, leaving the upper floors with reduced coverage. Hayes was shaking his head in disbelief. Ms. Chen, what you're describing sounds like surveillance for a hostile operation. Director Hayes, Margaret replied calmly, what I'm describing is basic preparation for a meeting where my background was likely to be questioned and my competence challenged. I needed to understand the environment and identify potential complications. If this had been surveillance for a hostile operation, you would never have detected it, and we wouldn't be having this conversation. Williams leaned back in her chair, studying Margaret with new respect. What else did your preparation reveal? Margaret returned to her seat but remained alert and ready to move. Your building's emergency response plan assumes threats will come from outside, but it has minimal provisions for internal threats. The communications system relies on a central switchboard that could be compromised by someone with access to the telecommunications room on the 3rd floor. Your backup power system has adequate capacity, but the fuel supply is stored in an unsecured area that could be targeted to disable your operations. She paused, noting the expressions around the table. More importantly, from a protective services perspective, this building's design makes it unsuitable for VIP visits. The single public entrance creates a choke point that can't be secured effectively. The parking garage doesn't have separate routes for secure arrivals and departures. And the elevator system could trap protectees in a confined space if the building were compromised. Blake was writing rapidly. You determined all of this in 3 days of observation? 3 days of systematic observation, yes. But I should mention that I've been conducting this type of assessment for 40 years. It becomes second nature after a while. Foster looked up from his notes. Ms. Chen, assuming your claims about your background are accurate, why are you sharing this information with us? Doesn't this compromise operational security? Margaret considered the question carefully. Director Foster, the security vulnerabilities I've identified are observable by anyone with basic training and patience. If I can identify them in 3 days, so can actual hostile actors. By sharing this information, I'm demonstrating both my capabilities and my commitment to helping you improve your security posture. Moore was studying the notes she had taken during Margaret's briefing. The level of detail you've provided, this isn't a casual observation. This is professional-grade intelligence gathering. Yes, Margaret agreed, it is. The simple acknowledgement hung in the air like a challenge. Williams was the first to respond. Ms. Chen, you've just admitted to conducting surveillance on a federal facility. That's a serious matter. Director Williams, Margaret replied. You asked me to demonstrate relevant skills. Surveillance and threat assessment are fundamental to protective work. If you're uncomfortable with the idea of protective agents gathering intelligence about environments where they'll be operating, then perhaps you need to reconsider what kind of security you're actually providing. Hayes shifted uncomfortably. There's a difference between legitimate security preparation and unauthorized intelligence gathering. Margaret's expression hardened slightly. Director Hayes, would you prefer protective agents who walk into situations blind, or agents who understand the environment well enough to identify and neutralize threats before they materialize? Because in my experience, the difference between those two approaches is often measured in lives. The challenge in her voice was unmistakable. For the first time since the interview began, Margaret Chen was allowing them to see past the polite, deferential facade she had maintained. This was someone accustomed to making life-and-death decisions, someone who had operated in environments where hesitation could be fatal. Blake recognized the shift immediately. Ms. Chen, no one is questioning the importance of thorough preparation. But there are protocols and legal boundaries that govern how federal agents conduct their work. Of course there are, Margaret agreed, her tone returning to its previous neutrality, and I'm familiar with most of them, but I'm also familiar with situations where following protocols exactly can get people killed. The question you need to ask yourselves is whether you want agents who can adapt to circumstances, or agents who prioritize procedure compliance over mission success. Moore leaned forward intently. Can you give us an example of what you mean? Margaret hesitated for the first time since the interview began. I'm afraid most of my operational examples remain classified. But I can say that protective work often requires making rapid decisions based on incomplete information. The ability to gather that information quickly and accurately can be the difference between preventing an incident and responding to one. Training Director Foster had been quiet during this exchange, but now he spoke up with obvious fascination. Ms. Chen, the techniques you've described, surveillance detection, vulnerability assessment, pattern analysis, these aren't skills that someone learns from a textbook. This is fieldcraft developed through extensive operational experience. Yes, Margaret confirmed, it is. Williams was shaking her head. I'm having trouble accepting that someone could develop this level of expertise while working as a hotel concierge and executive assistant. Margaret's smile was enigmatic. Director Williams, you're assuming that those positions were what they appeared to be. I'm telling you they weren't. The room fell silent as the implications of her statement settled over the committee. Hayes was the first to speak. Ms. Chen, are you saying that your civilian employment history was cover for intelligence operations? I'm saying, Margaret replied carefully, that some jobs require more than what appears in the official job description. Blake was studying her with the expression of someone trying to solve a complex puzzle. The background verification we're waiting for, it's going to confirm this, isn't it? It's going to confirm what it's authorized to confirm, Margaret answered. But yes, I believe you'll find that my actual experience is consistent with the claims I've made. At that moment, Blake's phone rang. He answered immediately, spoke briefly, and hung up. The verification team has arrived. They're coming up now. Margaret straightened in her chair. and for the first time since the interview began, she looked slightly apprehensive. The moment of truth was approaching, and even someone with 40 years of experience in deception and misdirection couldn't entirely control how this revelation would unfold. The next few minutes would determine whether Margaret Chen's greatest gamble, revealing herself after 4 decades in the shadows, would open the door to a new chapter in her career or end it entirely. She had spent her entire professional life convincing people she was someone other than who she appeared to be. Now she needed to convince them that she was exactly who she claimed to be. And that, she reflected, might be the most challenging operation of her career. The verification team consisted of 2 individuals who entered the conference room with the quiet authority of people accustomed to handling sensitive situations. The first was Agent Rebecca Torres, a woman in her 40s with the bearing of someone who had spent years in federal law enforcement. The second was Dr. William Grant, whose civilian clothes and academic demeanor suggested he served in an analytical rather than operational capacity. Agent Torres carried a briefcase that she set on the table with deliberate precision. "Director Blake, I'm Agent Torres from the Office of Security Review. This is Dr. Grant from the Intelligence Assessment Division. We're here to provide verification regarding Ms. Margaret Chen." Blake gestured toward Margaret, who had remained seated but alert throughout the team's arrival. "Ms. Chen, these are the verification officers I mentioned." Torres studied Margaret with the practiced eye of someone trained to assess both threats and assets. "Ms. Chen, we need to establish some parameters before we proceed. Are you prepared to have your background discussed in the presence of these officials?" Margaret nodded. "I am." Dr. Grant opened a tablet and consulted what appeared to be an extensive file. "Ms. Chen, your operational record spans 41 years, 7 months, and 16 days. During that time, you've been deployed under 47 different cover identities across 6 continents. Your success rate for mission completion is 97.4%. Is this accurate?" The committee members exchanged stunned glances. Williams was the first to find her voice. 47 different identities? Cover identities are standard procedure for long-term covert operations, Torres explained. Agents often assume multiple personas throughout their careers. Hayes was struggling to process the implications. 97.4% success rate over 40 years? That's unprecedented. Dr. Grant continued consulting his tablet. Ms. Chen's specialization has been protective operations in environments where traditional security protocols would be insufficient or counterproductive. Her work has involved safeguarding high-value assets who were unaware they required protection. Blake leaned forward intently. "Can you provide specifics about these operations?" Torres exchanged a glance with Dr. Grant before responding. "Some details remain classified above your clearance level. However, I can confirm that Ms. Chen has been involved in preventing 17 documented assassination attempts, 43 kidnapping plots, and numerous instances of espionage or sabotage directed against American interests." Foster was writing furiously, and all of this was done while maintaining civilian cover identities? "That was the requirement," Margaret spoke for the first time since the verification team arrived. "Traditional protective details create visible security footprints that can actually increase threat levels. My role was to provide protection that appeared invisible." Dr. Grant looked up from his tablet. "Ms. Chen, would you mind explaining to the committee how invisible protection works in practice?" Margaret considered the question carefully. Suppose a foreign minister's daughter is studying at an American university, and intelligence suggests she may be targeted for kidnapping. A traditional protective detail would assign visible agents, modify her schedule, restrict her movements, and essentially announce to everyone that she's considered high risk. This approach might deter some threats, but it also confirms to hostile actors that their target is valuable and tells them exactly what security measures they need to overcome. Williams was beginning to understand. But if protection is invisible, then hostile actors don't know their target is protected, Margaret continued. I might enroll as a graduate student in the same program, befriend the target naturally, and position myself to observe and intercept threats without anyone realizing that security measures are in place. The target lives normally, threats don't know they're being countered, and problems can be resolved before they escalate. Hayes shook his head in amazement. The level of preparation required for that kind of operation must be enormous. 6 months minimum for deep cover deployment, Margaret confirmed. Sometimes longer if the operational environment is complex. You have to master not just the role you're playing, but the entire ecosystem around that role. Academic programs, professional environments, social networks, cultural contexts. Any inconsistency can compromise the entire operation. Torres had been observing the committee's reactions carefully. Directors, what you're beginning to understand is that Ms. Chen represents a level of operational capability that's extremely rare. There are perhaps a dozen agents worldwide with comparable experience in long-term covert protective operations. Moore looked skeptical. If her capabilities are so exceptional, why is she applying for a position with our division? This seems like a significant step down from what you're describing. Dr. Grant consulted his notes. Ms. Chen has requested transition to overt protective operations for personal reasons that have been reviewed and approved by her supervising agency. The decision to allow this transition was made at the deputy director level. Blake was studying the verification documents Torres had provided. These clearance levels. I've never seen anything like this. Some of these classifications are above congressional oversight. Chen's work has involved protecting assets whose very existence is classified, Torres explained. In some cases, the success of her operations has been measured by the absence of public knowledge that threats ever existed. Margaret had been listening to this discussion with mixed feelings. On one hand, she was relieved that her background was being confirmed. On the other hand, she was uncomfortable with the level of detail being revealed. 4 decades of operational security habits made her instinctively resist any disclosure of classified information, even when that disclosure was authorized. If I may, Margaret interjected, I should point out that my previous work, while extensive, may not directly translate to the requirements of this position. Covert protection and overt protection involve different skill sets and operational challenges. Foster looked surprised. You're suggesting you might not be qualified for this job? I'm suggesting that qualifications are contextual, Margaret replied. My experience has been in preventing problems that principals never knew existed. Your work involves managing problems that everyone knows about. Those require different approaches. Torres was nodding approvingly. That's a mature assessment. In fact, Ms. Chen's transition evaluation identified several areas where additional training would be beneficial. Williams leaned forward with interest. What kind of additional training? Dr. Grant referred to his tablet again. Overt team coordination, public engagement protocols, media management, legal compliance in civilian environments, and integration with existing federal security frameworks. Ms. Chen's operational background emphasized independence and adaptability, but protective services require collaboration and standardization. Hayes was beginning to see the challenge, so despite 40 years of experience, there would still be a learning curve. Every career transition involves adaptation, Margaret acknowledged. But I believe my core competencies, threat assessment, crisis management, situational awareness, and protective instincts, would transfer effectively. Blake had been studying the verification documents with increasing fascination. According to this, Ms. Chen has language capabilities in 12 languages, cultural immersion training in 15 different operational environments, advanced tactical training in multiple disciplines. Torres confirmed with a nod. Long-term covert operations require extensive preparation. Agents must be able to function authentically in any environment where they're deployed. Moore was shaking her head in disbelief. The investment in training alone must have been enormous. Ms. Chen represents a significant government investment, Dr. Grant agreed. Her transition to overt work is intended to leverage that investment in new ways, rather than losing it to retirement. Margaret shifted uncomfortably. She had never enjoyed being discussed as though she were a resource to be managed, rather than a person making career decisions. If I may clarify, the decision to seek this position was mine. I'm not being reassigned or managed out of my previous role. Torres looked at her with something approaching respect. Ms. Chen requested this transition after 40 years of exemplary service. She's earned the right to choose her next assignment. Foster was studying his notes from the interview. Ms. Chen, earlier you demonstrated knowledge of this building's security vulnerabilities. Was that assessment conducted using techniques from your covert background? Standard surveillance and reconnaissance procedures, Margaret confirmed. Though I should note that in a covert environment, I would have spent weeks or months gathering that intelligence. The 3-day assessment I mentioned was actually quite superficial. Blake looked alarmed. Superficial? You identified dozens of security issues. Because the issues were obvious to anyone with appropriate training, Margaret explained. A thorough assessment would have revealed vulnerabilities you don't even know exist. But that level of analysis wasn't necessary for this interview. The committee was beginning to understand that they were dealing with someone whose capabilities extended far beyond what they had initially imagined. Hayes voiced what everyone was thinking. Ms. Chen, if your previous work was so classified and specialized, how do we evaluate whether you can adapt to our operational environment? Margaret stood and moved to the window again, her movement drawing the attention of everyone in the room. Directors, that's exactly the right question. And I believe the answer is to give me a practical test. Torres looked interested. What kind of test? Margaret turned back to face the room. You have VIP protection assignments coming up. Choose one that represents the kind of work this position would involve. Let me conduct a preliminary threat assessment and security planning exercise. Judge my performance based on results rather than credentials. Williams exchanged glances with her colleagues. That's an unusual request. It's a reasonable request, Margaret replied. You're being asked to hire someone whose background you can't fully verify through normal channels. The only way to evaluate whether my skills transfer to your operational environment is to test them directly. Dr. Grant was consulting his tablet again. Ms. Chen's training records indicate extensive experience with practical assessment methodologies. This would be consistent with her background. Blake was considering the proposal carefully. What kind of timeline are we talking about? That depends on the complexity of the assignment, Margaret answered. A simple venue security assessment could be completed in a few days. A comprehensive protection plan for a high-risk principal might require weeks. Moore was studying Margaret with new interest. You're essentially asking us to give you a trial assignment. I'm asking you to evaluate my capabilities based on performance rather than paperwork, Margaret clarified. After 40 years of covert work, I need to prove to myself as much as to you that my skills translate to overt operations. Torres was nodding approvingly. It's a professional approach to a complex transition. Foster looked around the table at his colleagues. Directors, this might actually be the most effective way to evaluate Ms. Chen's suitability for this position. Blake was clearly weighing the decision carefully. The verification process had confirmed that Margaret Chen was indeed who she claimed to be, but it had also revealed that her background was so far outside their normal experience that traditional evaluation methods might be inadequate. Ms. Chen, he said finally, if we were to approve such a test, it would need to be carefully controlled. You would work under direct supervision with limited access to sensitive information. Margaret nodded. I would expect nothing less. In fact, I would insist on it. The last thing either of us wants is for this trial period to compromise ongoing operations or create security vulnerabilities. Williams was beginning to see the potential benefits. It would give us a chance to observe your methods and evaluate compatibility with our procedures. Quote, and it would give me a chance to determine whether this transition is actually feasible, Margaret added. It's possible that 40 years of covert work has made me unsuitable for overt operations. Better to discover that during a controlled trial than after I've been hired. Hayes looked at the verification team. Would Ms. Chen's current handlers approve this arrangement? Torres consulted briefly with Dr. Grant before responding. Assuming appropriate security protocols are maintained, yes. In fact, a practical evaluation period would provide valuable data about transition success rates for agents with similar backgrounds. Blake looked around the table at his colleagues, noting their expressions of cautious interest. The interview had taken them far from their original expectations, but it had also presented them with an opportunity they had never anticipated. Miss Chen, he said, I think we're prepared to offer you that trial period. Are you ready to accept the challenge? Margaret Chen, who had spent 40 years accepting challenges that no one could ever know about, smiled for the second time since the interview began. Director Blake, she replied, I've been ready for this challenge my entire career. 2 weeks later, Margaret Chen stood in the security briefing room of the Phoenix Convention Center, surrounded by detailed floor plans, threat assessments, and surveillance photographs. Her trial assignment had materialized faster than anyone expected, protecting Senator Elizabeth Harper during a high-profile technology summit that would bring together international business leaders, government officials, and media representatives. The assignment was deliberately challenging. Senator Harper served on the Intelligence Committee and had recently been vocal about cybersecurity threats from foreign governments. Intelligence reports suggested multiple hostile actors might use the summit as an opportunity to gather information or send messages. The venue was a security nightmare: multiple entrances, underground parking, adjacent hotels, and thousands of attendees moving through interconnected spaces. Director Blake had assigned Agent Karen Rodriguez as Margaret's supervisor and liaison. Rodriguez was a 15-year veteran of protective services with an impressive record, but she had never worked with anyone who claimed Margaret's background. The partnership was meant to evaluate not just Margaret's capabilities, but her ability to integrate with existing teams. The advanced team has identified 37 potential vulnerabilities, Rodriguez explained, pointing to markers on the architectural drawings. Everything from sightlines for long-range threats to choke points where crowds could be used to mask hostile approach. Standard protocol would be to restrict the senator's movement to secure corridors and limit her public exposure. Margaret studied the plans carefully, her fingers tracing routes and noting details that weren't immediately obvious. Agent Rodriguez, what's the senator's priority for this event? Is she attending to be seen or to conduct private meetings? Both, Rodriguez replied. She's giving a keynote address on cybersecurity policy, but she also has scheduled meetings with technology executives and foreign officials. Her staff considers the networking opportunities as important as the public speaking. Margaret nodded, continuing her examination of the venue layouts. Traditional security approaches would compromise both objectives. Heavy protection details during public appearances would limit her ability to interact naturally with attendees. Restricted access to private meeting areas would reduce the networking value of the event. Rodriguez was watching Margaret's analysis with professional interest. The older woman's approach was methodical, but unconventional. Instead of focusing primarily on obvious threats and standard countermeasures, she seemed to be thinking several steps ahead about how security decisions would affect the principal's ability to achieve her objectives. "What are you proposing?" Rodriguez asked. Margaret moved to a whiteboard and began sketching a modified version of the venue layout. Layered invisible coverage. We position assets throughout the venue who appear to be conference staff, attendees, or media representatives. The senator moves through the event with minimal visible protection, but she's actually surrounded by coverage she's not aware of. Rodriguez frowned. That would require extensive coordination and a much larger team than we typically deploy. Not necessarily, Margaret replied, adding details to her sketch. Conference events like this already have substantial staff and volunteer workforces. We place our people within existing frameworks rather than adding obvious security elements. Quote. She pointed to different areas of her drawing. Catering supervisor here to monitor the kitchen and service areas. Technical support staff positioned to observe audiovisual equipment and communication systems. Registration volunteers who can identify suspicious attendees during check-in. Cleaning crew with access to areas that might be used for staging equipment or weapons. Rodriguez was beginning to see the scope of what Margaret was proposing. You're talking about infiltrating the entire conference infrastructure. I'm talking about becoming part of the conference infrastructure, Margaret corrected. The difference is that infiltration implies deception, while integration means providing actual value to the event while maintaining security objectives. Rodriguez consulted her notes from previous security briefings. Our standard approach would be to coordinate with venue security, establish secure zones, control access points, and maintain visible deterrence. Margaret nodded respectfully. Agent Rodriguez, that approach works well for many situations. But this event has international participants, media coverage, and political sensitivities. Visible security measures send messages about threat levels that might affect diplomatic relationships and business negotiations. The challenge Margaret faced was demonstrating her methods without compromising operational security or revealing techniques that should remain classified. She needed to prove her competence while working within the constraints of overt protective services. Let me show you something, Margaret said, moving to her laptop computer. She had spent the previous week conducting what she described as preliminary reconnaissance, though Rodriguez suspected the assessment had been far more thorough than preliminary. The screen displayed a detailed analysis of the convention center's operational patterns, staff schedules, vendor relationships, and security protocols. Margaret had identified optimal positioning for protective assets, escape routes that wouldn't be obvious to casual observers, and communication networks that could function independently of the venue's existing systems. "How did you gather all this information?" Rodriguez asked, impressed despite her skepticism about Margaret's unconventional methods. "Public sources, observation, and conversations with people who work in and around the venue," Margaret replied. "Nothing that required special access or covert techniques, but the analysis framework comes from experience with similar environments." Rodriguez studied the detailed charts and diagrams Margaret had prepared. The level of planning was far beyond what she had seen in 15 years of protective work. Margaret had anticipated scenarios that standard protocols didn't address and identified opportunities that traditional security planning typically missed. "This is incredibly thorough," Rodriguez admitted, "but implementation would require resources and coordination that go well beyond normal protective details." Margaret minimized the laptop display and turned to face Rodriguez directly. "Agent Rodriguez, may I ask you something? In your experience, what percentage of protective operations fail because of insufficient planning versus inadequate response to unexpected situations?" Rodriguez considered the question carefully. "Most failures occur when we encounter situations we didn't anticipate or prepare for." "Exactly," Margaret agreed. "Extensive planning isn't about covering every possible contingency. It's about understanding the operational environment well enough to adapt when circumstances change. The goal isn't to control everything that happens, but to position ourselves where we can influence outcomes effectively." Rodriguez was beginning to appreciate that Margaret's approach represented a fundamentally different philosophy about protective work. Traditional methods emphasized control, deterrence, and rapid response to identifiable threats. Margaret's methods seemed to emphasize prediction, integration, and prevention of threats before they materialized. "Walk me through a specific scenario," Rodriguez requested. "Suppose intelligence identifies a credible threat against the senator during her keynote address. How would your approach handle that situation?" Margaret returned to the whiteboard and began sketching a timeline. Traditional response would be to increase visible security, modify the senator's schedule, or relocate the speech to a more secure venue. All of these options confirm to hostile actors that we're aware of their threat and have specific information about their plans. She drew arrows indicating movement patterns and positioning. Alternative approach. We maintain the original schedule, but position response assets invisibly throughout the venue. If the threat materializes, we can neutralize it without revealing our intelligence capabilities or confirming what we know about hostile planning. Rodriguez was following the logic, but remained concerned about practical implementation. That requires absolute confidence in your team's ability to identify and respond to threats in real time. Yes, Margaret agreed, it does, which is why this approach only works with highly trained personnel operating in carefully prepared environments. It's not suitable for all situations or all teams. Rodriguez realized that Margaret was acknowledging limitations while demonstrating capabilities. The older woman wasn't claiming her methods were universally superior, but rather that they offered advantages in specific circumstances where traditional approaches might be inadequate. "Margaret," Rodriguez said, using her first name for the first time, "I have to ask, this level of planning and coordination, these analytical frameworks, this really comes from hotel and corporate work?" Margaret's smile was enigmatic. "Agent Rodriguez, let's just say that some hotels and corporations have more interesting clients than others." As they concluded their planning session, Rodriguez found herself in the unexpected position of being impressed by someone she had initially expected to mentor. Margaret's methods were unconventional, but they were also sophisticated in ways that suggested genuine expertise developed through extensive operational experience. The test was no longer whether Margaret could adapt her background to protective services. The test was whether protective services could adapt to incorporate Margaret's capabilities without compromising the security and operational requirements that govern their work. And that, Rodriguez realized, was a much more interesting challenge than anyone had anticipated. The Technology Summit began at 7 a.m. on a Tuesday morning in November, and by 7:15 a.m., Margaret Chen had already prevented the first potential security incident. A catering delivery truck had arrived 30 minutes early with a driver who couldn't provide proper identification for the specialized dietary requirements he claimed to be delivering. Margaret, positioned as a conference volunteer coordinator, had quietly directed the truck to a holding area while verifying the delivery schedule with her supervisor. The driver turned out to be legitimate, a last-minute replacement who had forgotten his credentials. But the incident demonstrated exactly what Margaret had been trying to explain during the planning sessions. In the complex environment of a high-profile conference, threats and innocent anomalies often looked identical until someone with experience made the distinction. Agent Rodriguez observed this interaction from her position at the main security command post, where she was coordinating the overall protective operation while monitoring Margaret's performance through a combination of surveillance feeds and encrypted communication channels. The older woman's approach was unlike anything Rodriguez had seen in 15 years of federal protective work. Margaret moved through the conference venue with the natural ease of someone who belonged there, but Rodriguez could see through the surveillance network that every movement was calculated, every conversation served multiple purposes, and every position provided optimal observation angles for the spaces where Senator Harper would be appearing throughout the day. By 9:30 a.m., Margaret had identified 2 additional security concerns that the advance team had missed. A maintenance worker who was asking unusual questions about the building's communication systems turned out to be conducting unauthorized intelligence gathering for a foreign media outlet. A conference attendee who had been photographing security personnel rather than conference activities was revealed to be a private investigator working for a corporate competitor of one of the summit's sponsors. Neither situation represented a direct threat to Senator Harper, but both were exactly the kind of secondary concerns that could complicate protective operations if they weren't identified and managed proactively. Margaret's ability to spot these issues while maintaining her cover as a conference volunteer impressed not just Rodriguez, but the entire security team watching from the command post. The first major test came at 11 a.m., when Senator Harper was scheduled to participate in a panel discussion about cybersecurity policy. The venue was the convention center's main auditorium, with over 800 attendees and live streaming to thousands more online. Traditional security protocols would have required extensive screening, restricted seating arrangements, and visible protective presence that would have changed the entire dynamic of the event. Margaret's approach was radically different. Instead of controlling the environment, she had positioned assets throughout the auditorium who could observe and respond to threats while appearing to be ordinary conference participants. A federal agent posed as a technology journalist in the front section. Another agent worked as a volunteer managing the audiovisual equipment. A third was stationed as an event photographer with mobility throughout the venue. Rodriguez watched through the surveillance network as Margaret coordinated this invisible security web using hand signals, text messages disguised as conference updates, and subtle positioning that looked casual but provided comprehensive coverage of every angle from which threats could materialize. The panel discussion proceeded normally until 11:43 a.m., when Margaret's network detected what appeared to be a coordinated surveillance operation targeting Senator Harper. 3 individuals in different sections of the auditorium were photographing the senator using equipment that seemed more sophisticated than typical conference documentation. Their positioning and timing suggested professional coordination rather than casual media interest. In a traditional security environment, this situation would have triggered immediate visible responses, agents moving to intercept the photographers, possible evacuation of the principal, certainly disruption of the ongoing panel discussion. Instead, Margaret's team responded with precision that was invisible to everyone except the people conducting the surveillance. The technology journalist in the front section began asking detailed questions that required the senator to turn toward different areas of the auditorium, making it difficult for the photographers to maintain consistent sight lines. The audiovisual volunteer adjusted camera angles and lighting in ways that created glare and shadows that interfered with unauthorized photography. The event photographer began moving through the audience, positioning herself to block or obscure the unauthorized cameras while appearing to document the event normally. Rodriguez watched this coordination unfold with growing amazement. In less than 5 minutes, Margaret's team had neutralized a sophisticated surveillance operation without anyone in the auditorium, including Senator Harper herself, knowing that anything unusual had occurred. The panel discussion concluded on schedule with enthusiastic applause. Senator Harper left the stage believing she had participated in a successful policy discussion, completely unaware that her security team had just prevented what intelligence analysis would later confirm was a foreign intelligence gathering operation. "How did you know?" Rodriguez asked Margaret during a brief break between events. "What made you identify those 3 as a coordinated team rather than independent media?" Margaret was reviewing updates on her tablet while maintaining her cover as a conference volunteer. "Timing, equipment, and positioning patterns," she replied quietly. Independent photographers would have different focal priorities and movement patterns. These three were working together to create comprehensive documentation from multiple angles. Their equipment was also more sophisticated than what conference attendees typically carry. Rodriguez was shaking her head in admiration. "I've never seen anything like that. You neutralized a significant threat without anyone knowing there was a threat." "That's the goal," Margaret replied simply. "The best protective operations are the ones where nothing appears to happen." The afternoon brought additional challenges that tested both Margaret's methods and her ability to work within the constraints of traditional protective services. Senator Harper's schedule included private meetings with foreign officials whose own security details had different protocols and expectations. Coordinating invisible protection while accommodating multiple visible security teams required diplomatic skills that went far beyond typical protective work. Margaret handled these complications with a combination of professional courtesy and subtle misdirection that impressed even the most skeptical members of Rodriguez's team. She managed to position American assets within the international security framework without creating conflicts or revealing the extent of the coverage she had arranged. By 4 p.m., when Senator Harper concluded her final meeting of the day, the technology summit had been completed without a single security incident reaching public attention. More importantly, from a protective services perspective, it had been completed without any compromise to the senator's ability to achieve her policy and networking objectives. The post-operation debrief took place in the same conference room where Margaret's interview had occurred 2 weeks earlier. Director Blake, Deputy Director Williams, and the rest of the hiring committee were present, along with Agent Rodriguez and several members of her security team. "Agent Rodriguez," Blake began, "please provide your assessment of Ms. Chen's performance during this trial period." Rodriguez consulted her notes, though she had already formulated her conclusions. "Directors, Ms. Chen's performance exceeded all expectations. She identified and neutralized multiple security concerns that our standard protocols would have missed. Her coordination of invisible coverage provided superior protection while preserving the principal's ability to conduct normal activities." Williams leaned forward with interest. "Can you be more specific about the security concerns she identified?" "Unauthorized intelligence gathering, foreign surveillance operations, and several categories of secondary threats that could have complicated our primary protective mission," Rodriguez replied. In each case, Ms. Chen's response was both effective and invisible. Assistant Director Hayes was studying the operational reports that had been compiled throughout the day. "According to this documentation, Ms. Chen prevented 4 potential security incidents without the principal ever knowing they occurred." "That's correct," Rodriguez confirmed. "More importantly, she did it while working within our existing command structure and maintaining compatibility with federal protocols." Security Chief Moore had been quiet during most of the debrief, but now she spoke with obvious respect. "Ms. Chen, the level of situational awareness you demonstrated today was extraordinary. You seemed to anticipate problems before they fully materialized." Margaret had been listening to this discussion with mixed feelings. Professional recognition was gratifying after decades of anonymous service, but she was also aware that her performance during the trial period had revealed capabilities that might make some people uncomfortable. "Chiefs," she said carefully, "I want to emphasize that today's success was the result of extensive preparation and favorable circumstances. The methods I used require significant resources and planning time that might not be available for all assignments." Training Director Foster was reviewing video footage from the surveillance network. "Ms. Chen, your coordination of the invisible security web during the panel discussion, that was remarkable. How did you train your team to respond so precisely without verbal communication?" "Agent Rodriguez's team was already highly skilled," Margaret replied. "I simply provided them with additional frameworks for nonverbal coordination and situational response. The credit belongs to their professionalism and adaptability." Blake was studying the comprehensive reports that had been compiled during the operation. "Ms. Chen, based on today's performance, I think it's safe to say that your transition from covert to overt operations has been successful." Margaret nodded gratefully, but her expression remained thoughtful. "Director Blake, if I may, I'd like to address something that's been concerning me throughout this process." "Please proceed." Margaret stood and moved to the window, a gesture that had become familiar during these meetings. "My background and methods represent significant departures from standard protective services protocols. While today's operation was successful, Integrating these approaches into your existing framework will require careful consideration of legal, operational, and policy implications. Williams was listening intently. What kind of implications are you concerned about? Authorization boundaries, resource allocation, coordination with other agencies, and documentation requirements, Margaret replied. Covert operations have different oversight mechanisms than overt protective services. Some of the techniques I use today might require additional clearances or policy modifications if they're going to be incorporated into standard procedures. Rodriguez was beginning to understand Margaret's concern. You're worried about the institutional impact of bringing covert methodologies into overt operations. I'm worried about creating problems for an organization that's been generous enough to give me this opportunity, Margaret clarified. My methods work, but they might not be suitable for widespread adoption without significant changes to existing frameworks. Blake exchanged glances with his colleagues before responding. Ms. Chen, that's exactly the kind of institutional awareness we need from senior personnel. Your concerns are valid, and they'll need to be addressed through policy review and procedural adaptation. Moore was nodding approvingly. It shows professional judgment to raise these issues, rather than assuming that successful performance automatically translates to organizational compatibility. Quote, Margaret returned to her seat but remained alert. Directors, I want to be clear about my intentions. I'm not seeking to revolutionize your operations or impose methods that don't fit your mission requirements. I'm hoping to contribute my experience in ways that enhance your existing capabilities without creating complications. Foster was studying the operational documentation with obvious fascination. Ms. Chen, regardless of policy considerations, what you've demonstrated today represents a significant advancement in protective methodologies. We'd be foolish not to find ways to incorporate these capabilities. Williams was considering the broader implications. The question is how to do that effectively and appropriately. Blake looked around the table at his colleagues, noting their expressions of respect and professional interest. The trial period had answered the original question about Margaret's qualifications, but it had also raised new questions about how to integrate exceptional capabilities into existing institutional frameworks. Ms. Chen, he said finally, I believe I speak for the entire committee when I say that we would like to offer you the position of Senior Protection Specialist, with the understanding that your role will include developing new methodologies and training protocols that can benefit our entire division. Margaret felt a surge of gratitude mixed with anticipation. After 40 years of protecting people who never knew her name, she was being offered the opportunity to protect people who would know exactly who she was and what she was doing for them. Director Blake, she replied, I accept your offer, and I look forward to learning as much from your organization as I hope to contribute to it. As the meeting concluded, and the participants began gathering their materials, Margaret Chen reflected on the journey that had brought her to this moment. The shy, anonymous agent who had spent 4 decades in the shadows was about to begin a new chapter where her expertise could be acknowledged, her methods could be refined, and her experience could be shared with a new generation of protective services personnel. The woman who had been dismissed as inexperienced had not only proven her qualifications, but had also demonstrated capabilities that would reshape how her new organization approached protective work. She had successfully transitioned from covert to overt operations, while maintaining the professionalism and effectiveness that had defined her career. But perhaps most importantly, Margaret Chen had finally found a way to be herself while continuing to do the work she loved, protecting others, preventing problems, and ensuring that the people who needed security could live their lives without fear. After 40 years of being invisible, she was ready to be seen. And after 4 decades of protecting strangers, she was looking forward to protecting people who might actually become colleagues, friends, and eventually, the kind of professional family she had never been able to have. The woman who had been told she had no experience had just proven that sometimes the most valuable experience comes from places no one expects to find it. And sometimes the best way to prepare for the future is to finally reveal who you've always been. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hits the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.